Back on the Sam Roberts Show, the Ayatollah of rock and roll with Chris Jericho. Now, I have to ask you.
My career is just going in the toilet. They booked me in the Sam Roberts Show. Jeez.
But they put you in a better studio with me this time.
They did.
Which makes you think, oh, he must be onto something now, this kid.
He must have gone to 12 listeners instead of 8.
I wanted to know, at what point, like, because in the beginning, you're a young guy. You're trying to get attention on yourself. You're just a goofball. So you're doing things like Ayatollah of rock and roll, and you're coming up with as many weird things. At some point, do you make the conscious decision, well, I've kind of established myself. I don't need to be a goon anymore?
So you're talking about in the wrestling world?
I guess, yeah.
I thought you were just talking about me in general.
What?
Jeez, Sam, man.
Yeah, I didn't know we knew each other that well.
The biggest thing is that when you're talking about the WCW years, but that was, I had already had 6 or 7 years of experience around the world.
Right.
Being a headliner. I mean, I was in Mexico, I was a teen heartthrob, Sam, but I was a main event guy, as a good guy. And in Japan, I was a main event bad guy with the company I was in. And in Canada, I was all the small shows I did in Canada, or ECW, Smoky Mountain Wrestling, all those places. I had specific characters and specific, I guess, understanding of what I was supposed to be doing. When I got to WCW, I didn't really know for sure. It was very, there really wasn't a lot of direction, and especially as a good guy at the time. That was when the NWO had just started, and they were cool heels,
right?
Is what we call them, and they ate baby faces alive. So if you had a baby face with no personality, or never given a chance to have a personality like me, you'd go to the ring with these guys doing anything you could. That's why I used to throw my back to the crowd and have them, I remember Jacques Rouge was like, why would you throw your back to the crowd with the guys? They can't touch you. Are you some kind of gaze? And I was like, no, I'm just trying to get something going.
Yeah.
And as a result, so you'd go out there with those guys and they'd eat you alive, so you'd have no chance. So when I finally got a chance to turn heel, then there was no rules. It was like I could color outside the lines and just do anything that entertained me, because just to keep myself going, and also try and stand out in any way, shape, or form. And that's when it started working, when people started taking notice of me.
And you're in a place where now it's big guys. Everybody's paying attention to big guys. So you kind of have to just say things that make people go, what? What is he?
Well, and maybe not necessarily big guys in stature, but it was all about the NWO and anybody that was working the NWO there. And even though I'll to this day, and I would tell anybody this, it was the undercard guys that kept that exciting and kept it afloat, because the NWO might have been getting all the emphasis and bringing in the money, but it was the undercard that kept people entertained, because those main event matches that they were having were the shits. They were bad. Yeah. So it was.
Well, I mean, that kind of era is kind of personified for amazing builds, like Hogan and Sting and Bret Hart coming in, and then the matches being horrible.
Piper and Flair, right? And all of these matches. And so it was the guys of my generation that really kept that going. And then when we were able to show some personality, it was almost like, even though we got over really good, they still didn't embrace it. The company never got behind it. If you look at some of the guys, like from Eddie Guerrero to Jericho to, Juventud, whoever was getting over on their own, you would never get to that next step. So that's why I just started going more and more just outside the box. I'm just going to entertain myself. You know what?
And at some point, I don't give a fuck anymore. Like, I'm just going to do.
If you've ever seen a couple pictures where my hair is standing straight up, like higher than yours is.
Yeah.
I remember one night they gave me something stupid to do, and I sat there and I hadn't had a shower that day, and I was like rubbing my head like, what am I going to do? And I looked up in the mirror and my hair was standing straight up like, Poison in 1986. And I was like, you know what? I feel as stupid as I look from this angle. So I'm going to go to the ring just with I'm just going to go out there and look this stupid. And yeah, basically, you don't give a fuck. And not only that, it's like you still have pride in what you're doing, but also knowing, you know what, this is wrestling. I can do whatever I want.
Right.
And as long as I commit to it, I can go out there with my hair standing up on end. And as long as I act like nothing's wrong, people will go, what's going on with that guy? And that's how it started rolling.
Because when you don't give a fuck anymore, it's like you still give a fuck about the performance,
of course,
and your part, but you just are not afraid anymore of what any boss is going to tell you.
There's no ramifications. I remember one night I told this story. Chavo told this story when he was on my podcast, Talk is Jericho, available on podcast1.com. We were working each other every week, it seemed, on Nitro and on Thunder, and he now was the baby face with a little bit of personality, but I was the heel, but I would never be the cool heel. So we would always work, but at the end of every match, I would beat him with my finish. And it's like, why are we still working? I've beaten the baby face. He's submitting to the lion tamer at the time. We need to do something different. So he had this stick horse called Pepe. If you remember that angle, he would talk into Pepe, and Pepe was his friend, and he was kind of losing his mind. So the idea for this one, I told the booker, was Terry Taylor. Like, Terry, I beat him every week. Like, we need to change this. He goes, okay, fine. Well, then you break Pepe. You at the end. I'm like, oh, so I'm going to beat him and break his gimmick? He's like, yeah. I'm like, this sucks. So me and Chavo.
So you spent all this time building this gimmick where this weird Mexican guy is walking around with a horse on a stick. That's his whole gimmick, that everybody's like, oh, I like him because he's nuts. He's got a horse on a stick. And when you go, we got to do something to freshen it up, they're just like, oh, okay, that thing we were building, let's just end it.
Just end it. Just break it in half. And I was like, this is okay, fine. So I said to Chavo, get in the car. We were in Fargo, North Dakota. We drove to Toys R Us. And I was looking for a giant horse head and an aluminum baseball bat. So I bought the baseball bat, and I found the giant horse head, like a giant pogo stick, I guess if you call the little one a little. And I stuck the giant head onto the baseball bat. We drove back to the arena, walked down, and put it underneath the ring. Now, nobody knows that we're doing this, and this just shows how crazy WCW is. Yeah. If you did that in WWE, you'd be fired in a second.
What would Vince say if you walked back after doing a spot with a baseball bat that you just did it?
You wouldn't walk back to the curtain because you'd probably get physically assaulted and you'd be fired on the spot.
That'd be it,
yeah. Or yelled at, and the person, like the producer you were working with would get yelled at, the ref, the camera guys, everybody. There'd be a shitstorm.
Yeah.
But in WCW, nobody cared. So we just put it in the ring, had the match. I beat Chavo, and I didn't break Pepe. I kicked Chavo, and I threw him out of the ring, and then I took Pepe and started like stepping on it and dropping elbows on it, and and holding up like I was gonna break it. And the crowd's like, don't break Pepe. Meanwhile, Chavo's gotten Pepe's older brother Jose and pulled
Super Pepe.
Yeah, basically, yeah. And Jose, his baseball bat turns around, hits me in the stomach, hits me on the back, and then rides around on the giant Pepe, and everyone's cheering. And it worked out great, but no one knew we were doing it, and no one said a word about it.
And you just changed an entire storyline.
Everything.
The whole story has changed from what the boss, quote unquote, had told you to do.
And we had actually gone and bought a prop and put it in the ring, and it made TV, and then nobody cared.
Nobody said a word.
Nothing.
They're just like, oh, I guess somebody else must have given him approval.
Yeah, or we might have got, that was actually a good idea. I was going to suggest that, but I forgot, or something like that. It was really weird there. So, bottom line, long answer to your original question is, I just did whatever I could do to try and stand out, and then didn't care anymore. And then when I realized that I was not going to get any further, when we did that Goldberg thing, when there was like a midget Goldberg, and I challenged Goldberg to a fight, and I beat the midget Goldberg, but the real Goldberg got mad for real. And it was just this long rigmarole thing where I knew that no matter what I did, I would never get to the main event. And that's when I was like, I need to get out of here.
Yeah.
And then once I got to WWE, I kind of still had a little bit of that character, but realized very quickly that wasn't going to fly in the WWE. Comedy does not draw money, is what I've learned.
And because you now have to pitch what you're going to do,
right,
and actually follow through with it. And to say I'm going to put my hair in a thing and I'm going to call myself this,
right.
One person, Vince has got to be looking at you like, what?
Well,
no, the thing is, that's not funny.
And when I first came in, Vince Russo was the guy who brought me in, and he was the quote unquote head writer. Vince is always the head writer, but so Vince Russo's style of booking is very comedic and just outlandish. But he left after 2 months that I was there, and that's when I was kind of left to drift for a while, and then kind of had to turn everything around.
I got you, because you're kind of a Vince Russo guy, quote unquote.
I was, exactly,
and then
right. And if you look, when I first got there, Howard Finkel was my manager. That sort of thing. And I was doing things where I would come to the ring in a suit of armor, or be in a Shark Tank because Ken Shamrock was after me. So it was still like a continuation of that Y2J started, but it was that continuation of the Ayatollah of rock and roll, paragon of virtue WCW guy. Brought that into WWE and did it for a couple months when Russo was there. Then when he left, it was like cut loose, and like now I really had to start reconfiguring things.
There's got to be some of that stuff going on with guys now, because it seems like behind the scenes, more and more Triple H is taking a leadership role. And there have got to be guys, I mean, you know, you would only have an opinion on it, but there have got to be guys that were brought in by Vince McMahon who are Vince guys that are now kind of...
Well, you can see that. I mean, you can watch the show and you can see guys like, you know, Dolph Ziggler or Kofi Kingston, you know, very talented performers, but kind of lost in space, you know, because it's all about the guys that are established. You've seen as in Ortons and those type of guys. And then the newer guys that they're bringing in, you know, Wyatt and Cesaro and The Shield and those type of guys. So the guys that were kind of in the middle that came in around 2005 or 6, they're kind of floundering. You can see it. And there's no reason for it other than they're just kind of old news right now.
And what can a guy like that do? Because like you said, these guys can't just go out and do their own thing because they know they'll be fired. I mean,
I don't think fired is exactly the word. You might get reprimanded, but at this point, if I was those guys, I would change my look on my own. I would just show up one day with a haircut or new tights or new costume or whatever and just totally start reinventing myself. And because at this point, you got nothing to lose.
Now, have you always been a guy that's like, well, I got nothing to lose. If I get fired, I'll just go do that. Because now you actually have nothing to lose. Because now you have the band, you have the podcast, you can always go back to wrestling because you kept yourself in shape. So you actually do. Did you have that mindset back then? Like I'm talented enough that I don't have to wrestle.
Well, I had that mindset, but it was more like I can go elsewhere. You know, I had a good career in Japan.
Right.
Things are a little bit different though. You could go to Japan and work, or you could go to Mexico and work.
There's not even any place in America to go work.
Really, yeah. But WCW, it's like I had like a secret meeting with Vince a year before my contract expired at WCW, or I went to his house in like '98. My contract didn't expire till '99. I actually secret meeting, like show up where the limousine driver has a different name on the on the card when you're waiting at the airport. And so I knew that I was going to WWE a year before I left WCW. So I didn't care anymore because I know I'm going.
So you got that.
Yeah, and Vince said, don't worry, whatever they want you to do, don't worry about it. Do it. Whatever they want you to do, do it, and just get out of there and come over here. When I had some issues with Vince, where it was like when I first got there, he was going to fire me right off the bat. And I thought, well, I'll just go back to Japan. And then when I left in 2005, I was just so burned out, I didn't care.
Plus, you had made some money.
I'd made some money, but I had a family to support. But it wasn't like I was a millionaire. But I had to leave. I had no choice, and then kind of beat the bushes and did a couple gigs and worked a few things, but nothing major. And then kind of got that desire to go back to wrestling again. And that's when I had nothing to lose at that point.
And I guess that would be a trick too. Like if you leave now when you've got nothing going on and somehow can build up a buzz to come back to, all of a sudden you're not the guy that's been there the whole time. You're the guy who's freshly back.
I mean, that's the way the business worked when I first started. Is you would go from a territory to territory, and when things started getting stale, you would just leave.
Yeah.
And then you could always come back. Like if you look at Stampede Wrestling or any type of wrestling back then, even the old WWF when if Stan Hansen lost his title match to, Hogan or Backlund or whatever, he would just go split to Minneapolis, or he would go to Charlotte, or he would go to Portland, or go to Japan. And then after 6 months or a year, he could come in again. Oh my God, it's the return of Stan Hansen. So that's kind of, in WWE, I've always done that.
Right.
Especially over the last 5 or 6 years. And that's why I do it. If I start feeling things are getting stale, or start feeling that, I'm on a little bit of a downswing in a way that I don't like. Not that I'm taking my ball and going home, but I'm doing shorter contracts to know it's only 6 months. I can just split after it.
Was that survival? Because I've wondered, because you're a guy who's like completely just whatever you were obsessively into stuff as a kid. And I think a lot of people can relate to that because a lot of kids are obsessively into stuff.
Right.
And for some reason, people grow out of it. But you followed the things that you were obsessively into as a kid and are doing them professionally.
Yeah.
But most of the time, you get too close and you realize it's not what it was when you were a kid. Like, how do you stop yourself from being like, wait, this isn't as cool as I thought it was. This is
called getting jaded, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's the same thing as someone who's been married for a long time. And the saying is, show me a hot chick and I'll show you somebody that's tired of having sex with her. And you know what I mean? It's like, how could you not? But you get complacent. But for me, See, the difference for me is I've never considered myself as a wrestler. I've considered myself as an entertainer.
Even when you were young and just wrestling.
Yeah, but I wasn't always just wrestling. I was still playing music.
Okay.
Just not professionally, but because how do you get to be a professional musician? But I still had bands, still recorded records, still recorded songs. I still always, did, I would make my own movies or whatever it was. So I always had articles in magazines. I used to write for Metal Edge. I used to write for WCW magazine. I like to write, so I wrote. I like to play music, so I did.
So wrestling was just something that you did.
Well, it wasn't something that I did. It was definitely a passion.
Right.
But I had other passions.
Right.
And the only reason I ever made it in wrestling was because I was able to utilize my passion for music, my passion for acting.
Mm-hmm.
I made it because of my character. When I started in 1990, it was about 6'8", 300-pound guys. Look who was on top.
Mm-hmm.
Warrior, Hogan, Luger, those guys. And they're massive. I'm not massive. But I could have the biggest personality and I could have the biggest charisma on the show. And I always wanted to be the ultimate rock and roll frontman in wrestling. I wanted to be the Paul Stanley of wrestling, the David Lee Roth of wrestling. So all of the techniques that I started using in wrestling, I took from music, then took those same characteristics and put them back into music when we started Fozzy.
Right. Because
So
you go, okay, I figured out how to be the David Lee Roth of wrestling. I'm pretty sure I could also do this in music.
Right. It's all about connecting with the audience.
Yeah.
And you want people to have a good time. And in the WWE, whether I was a good guy or a bad guy, I want people to get their money's worth when I come to the ring. That's one of the reasons why I'm still valuable to the WWE, because I always make things good.
So you think the key is to not allow yourself to get entirely invested into one thing?
Well, I mean, I can't say that. I just, like, who else ever has made it in wrestling and music? Like, I'm the only one that really legitimately, like, it wasn't just like a side project or a lark. Like, music is my life. And, we will tour with, like I said, a Metallica or go with Avenged Sevenfold and whip their asses or do our best to do that. The reason for that is passion, and I've always had, for whatever reason, the way that I'm built, the way that I'm wired, it was always music and wrestling.
So there's no part of you, like when you're doing a small venue for Fozzy, because in the States you do like big clubs. There's no part of you that's on that stage being like, well, if I was wrestling, I'd be in front of like 40, 50,000 people.
But the thing is, we're doing Rock on the Range this weekend in Columbus, where we will be in front of 40, 50,000
So you have
people.
that.
Because wrestling is not 40, 50,000 people every night either.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I mean, there's some nights that I wrestle with the WWE in front of less people than I play with Fozzy. Sometimes you go and there'll be a crowd of 800, or there'll be a crowd of 1,200 or 1,500. I mean, we do that with Fozzy sometimes, not every night. Sometimes with Fozzy, you go and you play in front of 200 people.
Right.
But it's the same point. If I'm wrestling in the WWE and we go do a show in Hoboken, New Jersey, or White Plains, I mean, you do those shows. And
I know. I've been to the county center many times.
Yeah. There's 800 people there.
Yeah.
But you still go out there and have a great match for those people.
Yeah.
And it's the same with Fozzy. We do have our WrestleMania. We're going to download this year in June 14th. We'll be playing in front of 100,000 people. That's more than WrestleMania.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's all relative to, not every show is Mania, not every show is download, but every show is equally as important.
When you're pursuing this, and when you were pursuing wrestling, and then when you're in wrestling and now seriously pursuing music, do you just have to figure out how to cut everybody off in terms of their opinions?
Oh, absolutely.
Because even when you're a world famous wrestler and you're like, okay, I'm going to do this rock band now, I would assume most of the people around you are going like, all right, Jericho,
oh yeah, whatever,
go do your rock band.
But let's go back earlier when I was going to become a world famous wrestler. Everyone told me I was crazy.
And you just keep that with you.
You're too small.
Right.
You'll never make. I remember at my church, my pastor was a really cool pastor, and said, Chris is going to Calgary to be a wrestler. And people started laughing.
Mm-hmm.
I remember this to this day, people laughing in church at like who the fuck laughs at church at somebody who has a dream?
It's exactly what that's where you're supposed to be able to do that.
Go, you go for it. And so I never forgot that. I would tell people I was going to go be a wrestler, and they'd be like, you might as well be telling me you're going to be a mime or a sword swallower in the circus. Like, what? Especially then, because how do you become a wrestler? Now, I mean, there's a way you do it. You go to the performance center. It's very prestigious. Back then, how do you become a wrestler? How do you get into a rock band?
Right.
There was no way to know. You just kind of went and tried your best to go find out. So I've always dealt with that.
Yeah.
And I remember, once again, Paul Stanley said this in a movie I saw back in 1987 called Decline of the Western Civilization Part 2. And he said, he goes, the people that tell you can't do something are those that have failed.
Yeah.
He said, I'm not going to tell you can't do something because I did it. You can do it too.
Mm-hmm.
And I always remembered that, like the wise words of Paul Stanley to this day that I always think of. I just eliminated the negative people. You can't do this. Why not? Because
you didn't?
Because you didn't?
Right.
Because no one ever, like, why can't I?
And is that how you look at podcasting? Do you, or is podcasting?
Everything.
You
Everything
do.
I do.
So you're just like, I'm going to keep doing this
Yeah.
until I feel like I'm good at it.
Yeah, exactly. Or until I feel I've made it to the level that I want to make it at.
Right.
And wrestling too, the reason why I was able to be successful in wrestling early in my career is because even though it was all based around size, I found places where size didn't matter. Europe, Mexico, Japan. And that's why the first 6 years of my career I spent over there, where I was a bigger guy, but even more importantly, it was all about how good is your match? How good can you perform? And then once I learned that, when I came to the States, even though, you're talking about WCW and the cool heels and getting eaten alive, I still knew I could work. I knew I could whip anybody's ass in the ring.
Right.
And when I got in there with guys like Benoit and Eddie and Malenko and Mysterio that could whip ass too, that's why we were untouchable. That's why I always knew Daniel Bryan would make it, or CM Punk, or all these guys that came in to the WWE that they were deemed, they're too small, they don't fit the system. They're too good, and it's still wrestling. It's just like with Fozzy. We're too good that you can throw everything you want. Oh, it's a wrestling band, or the band is called Fozzy, or whatever reason you want to throw at it why it can't work.
Yeah.
We blow them away because the band rocks.
And that's like kind of a lesson that people don't understand too. It's like people get so wrapped up in either trying to impress the fans or trying to prove fans or just worrying about what people are saying. They don't realize if you just did it and just continue to do it and do it and do it and do it
and do it. If you have a passion for it and you're good at it, go for it. I loved this year, and this is my go-to guy. I've never met him, but if I did, I'd shake his hand and I'd say thank you for doing this. When Jared Leto won the Oscar this year, for Dallas Buyers Club, the next month he sold out the Hollywood Bowl with 30 Seconds to Mars. There's no problem with Jared Leto being a musician and being an actor.
Right.
He's getting pats on the back for it.
Right.
But yet Jericho is a musician and a wrestler. Well, you can't do that. Why?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to say I'm good at both, but I have a passion for both.
Right.
And the proof is there. So
you've been successful at both. You could say that without.
And to be successful at both because I do things that are good at both. I'm not the best wrestler in the world, but I kick ass when I'm in the ring. Not the best singer in the world, but I kick ass when I'm on stage.
And now you're a podcaster too.
Podcaster as well, and that's been going great also.
And I was wondering, because it's an interview podcast.
Yes.
But it's not just wrestlers, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But and
it's not just interviews either. I do characters on the show. Like anything I want to do, I'll talk about whatever I'm interested in. I've got this guy called Egypt that I used to have my own wrestling league when I was in high school called the BTWF. And Egypt was this janitor in my high school that had this weird accent nobody can understand. It's like he sounds like he's from Egypt, so he was called Egypt. He interrupted one of our big matches one day, like because I was on top of a ladder about to jump off, and he came in and was like, "No, get off ladder, do get off ladder." So now Egypt
does sound like he's from Egypt.
Yeah. So now Egypt is on my show, and he helps me for every pay-per-view we do predictions. So I do my predictions, and Egypt does his. So I do characters. I do whatever I want because it's my show, and then it always kind of wrapped around interview.
Did it always a couple of things? Number one, I was going to ask, is it annoying to have to ask people to do interviews? Because you associate with these people, and it's one thing whether it's wrestlers or celebrities. It's one thing to be like, yeah, we're cool, and then it's another thing to say, hey, I'm working on this. Will you come do it with me? And then the second question is, were you always from the beginning, were you like, yeah, I don't mind doing pay-per-view predictions? Or at first, were you like, I don't want to be a wrestling fan. I'm a wrestler.
But the thing is, I am a wrestling fan.
And you don't mind?
Not at all. It's part of who I am. If I turn my back on wrestling, that'd be like, Robert Plant turning his back on Zeppelin. Like what? What's wrong with you? Yes, I do other projects. Yes, I'm not even going to say it gets tedious when people ask me when I'm going back to wrestling because it's cool to know that they care. But my point is I have no problem. I do whatever I want. But all I ask is if you're a Chris Jericho fan, just trust me. Because if I think it's cool, I guarantee you'll like it.
Well, we were talking about this before. I mean, I upload lots of interviews on my YouTube channel and have gotten a ton of attention from wrestling fans because I started doing a ton of wrestling interviews.
Yeah.
But anytime there's an interview on that YouTube channel that is not a wrestler, the first comments are always like, when are we going to get another wrestler? Who is this? Who cares?
But that's, wrestling fans are very, single-minded that way. I'll get that too. Like I said, I had William Shatner on my podcast the other day. I mean, to me, that's as big as you can get.
Yeah.
You know, that's 50 years of show business. You know, I just, and how did I get him? I asked him.
You just sent him a message.
I just sent him a message. I happened to run into him at a Comic-Con that I was doing, and he happened to be promoting something. So he came in my studio in LA, in Beverly Hills. Came in on his own, no handlers.
That's the best.
Dude, he called because he was 10 minutes late. I'm sorry, I'm stuck in traffic. I thought he had his handler call. So not only was he called because he was late, which is rare in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Then he shows up on his own with no handler. He drove himself there. I'm like, dude, like, that's, I figured you would have a whole lot of handlers. That's the Hollywood way. He goes, oh, I gave up on that shit 30 years ago.
That's awesome.
And we just had the greatest conversation. And then once again, I put this up and people are like, well, they would rather me have the most lowly independent guy, Johnny Casino here from the IFW, FFWA. Wow, that's great. William Shatner, dude, I'm sorry. I will have him on any day. And yes, I do have wrestlers on. No doubt about it. But I also am not going to have no problem having Sebastian Bach or Rob Zombie or Vinnie Paul or Howie Mandel or Eli Roth or William Shatner or whoever I can get that I think is. I've had a ghost hunter on. I've had a Bigfoot hunter on, a UFO hunter, because I love that shit. So if I like it, you got to trust me.
And you know what's got to be the most difficult part for you is that, yes, wrestling fans are single-minded, but non-wrestling fans are also single-minded. Right. So if somebody doesn't like wrestling, they want nothing to do with it ever.
Ever. And that's why I'd be shooting myself in the foot if I'm trying to have a successful podcast that's all wrestling. You're painting yourself in a corner.
Yeah.
Why would you do that?
Yeah. Especially with as many wrestling podcasts as there are out there.
That's exactly.
It's got to be a Chris Jericho podcast.
It's a Chris Jericho podcast with all the things that I find interesting, exciting. It's a pop culture podcast. And people are getting them. Some of my non-wrestling shows have been higher than some of my wrestling shows. Like my Dave Mustaine podcast was huge. The Shatner one is huge. Adam Carolla was huge.
Yeah.
So those numbers are still bigger than some of the wrestling ones. And I like that because it shows people are starting to trust me and listening to what I'm saying. You will be entertained. Just shut up and listen. You know, I promise.
Give it a chance.
I get it, but trust me.
Yeah.
I like wrestling too, but trust me.
I've gone from like, oh, Sam, he's the O&A guy, to now I'm starting to drift into another, oh, Sam, he's the wrestling guy. And it's like, just...
Yeah, you're Sam. You're Sam, the personality.
Yeah.
And that's what goes back. I'm Chris Jericho, the entertainer.
The dude.
The dude. And if I'm doing something, I promise you'll like it. Because if I didn't like it, I wouldn't be doing it.
WWE must have wanted you back for WrestleMania this year.
We talked about it, but they didn't want me back to the point where there was something major for me to do. Yes, they would love to have me back, and yes, I would love to go back, but where would I fit in on a card where Triple H is coming back, Undertaker's coming back, Brock Lesnar's coming back, Hulk Hogan's coming back, Ultimate Warrior is coming back, Batista's coming back, The Shield is on the rise, Daniel Bryan's on the rise, Cesaro's on the rise. That's 10 guys right there.
Right.
Where does Jericho fit in on that? And you know where I would have fit in? I probably would have been in the Under the Giant Battle Royal, and that would have driven me nuts. And I knew
what are you doing coming back?
It's a waste of time for me. Yeah. And you know, last year I did the thing with Fandango. In retrospect, it actually worked out really good. If you watch those shows, especially the night after WrestleMania, that guy was the most over guy on the show.
Yeah.
And I'll take a lot of credit for that because we worked that up. Was it the exact optimum position that I wanted? Of course not. But it worked out. I made it work, but I didn't want to go through that again this year.
Does it drive you crazy in hindsight that he hasn't stayed as over as he was, or is your job done?
My job's done. Once I'm stopped working with him, there's nothing I can do. I put John Cena over in 2002, his very first pay-per-view. It whipped ass. 2 months later, he's losing to everybody on Sunday Night Heat or whatever show was on at the time. And I was like, why are you killing this guy? We just worked this program and people liked it. Well, he doesn't have anything. I disagree. Now, look, legendary John Cena, one of the biggest names of all time. But that's kind of like all I can do is focus on the work at hand.
Right.
And once I'm done with it, I got no control over it.
They're wrapping you up here. I appreciate, by the way, that you've waited till later in life to start getting tattooed.
I just never had any good ideas before. I always wanted some, and then I got this pumpkin with M Shadows from Avenged Sevenfold.
Yeah.
And that's all I had was just this random pumpkin in the middle of my front. So I thought, I better put something around it. So I put together a collage of my favorite bands and then kind of just went from there.
Have you seen my Rob Zombie?
I have not seen it.
Let me show you real quick.
He's going to take off his shirt.
It's signed, too.
Wow, that's...
See?
Well, that's not... Yeah, that's the Zombie logo, so that's cool. It's not exactly you have a picture of Rob Zombie, which would have been weird.
But then I got his autograph there.
Who's underneath? Jack?
That's Jack White.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Jack White tattoo. Okay.
Yeah.
You know what you need, dude?
What?
After all these years, you can ask me because when I first started coming in here, you wouldn't even talk to me. You're so scared.
I was.
I will sign your back and you can get a Chris Jericho.
Yeah, that's
tattoo.
what I was waiting for. And by the way, speaking of just keep doing things and eventually you'll be somebody, like Chris Jericho said. And I was actually talking to my wife the other day. I'm like, Jericho is one of these guys because the wrestlers I interview now, they come in, they're like, oh yeah, it's just a guy you talk to. You're one of the guys who I feel like I've had to work extra hard because you saw me when I was just like a scrub, like one of those random.
Yeah, I still think of you as a scrub.
Exactly.
That's why I'm like, you have your own show. I thought you were still getting coffee for an O&A, man.
That's what I'm saying. But
but congratulations. Like you said, you stick with something long enough, and eventually everybody else will quit, and you'll get your chance.
That's what I'm waiting for. Thank you, Chris Jericho.
Thanks, man.